This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam. I'm your host, and I'm joined by Richard Blackaby.
Always good to be with you, Sam.
Glad when you can find time in your busy schedule to stop by and have a little chat.
Well, I'm headed to the airport in about 3.5 hours, so we've got to make this quick.
Well, we'll make hay while the sun shines, as they say. Yeah, well, you seem to be darting hither and thither these days. And
I'll tell you what, though, that Atlanta airport is as full as I have seen it. The COVID slump is over. It's craziness, and the minions are everywhere in the airport right now.
Yeah, well, my 3-year-old, she always points out every airplane that flies overhead. She always reminds me that you're on it. So so she knows you as the traveling man. So
yeah. Well,
and speaking of my 3-year-old and I guess maybe parenting at large, often we're told to sort of to be filled with grace. Where I'm obviously a huge softy when it comes to my kids, and I'll let them run all over me if given the chance. But there are times when you have to be the disciplinary. I know it's shocking that that Claire would
discipline
ever
that angelic
angel,
child.
I know, but I think that sort of just brings up in all of us. There's sort of this need at times to be hard, to be tough, though there are plenty of times to sort of be soft and be gracious, if you will. But I thought we'd sort of unpack that some today, and maybe to start with, like, are there times when you have to be, as a Christian, like it seems sort of counterintuitive to Christianity, to leaders, when you have to be hard, like you want to just be full of grace and love to everyone that you meet? And maybe you can help us unpack and figure out when, if at all, are there times to be hard or tough love or so forth.
Yeah, I think there's interesting contrast throughout the Bible, where, like, it may say about Jesus, he was full of grace and truth, and sometimes that can seem to be an opposite. Are you going to tell the hard truth to people, even if it hurts, or are you just going to be gracious and just keep saying kind things?
Well, you get those guys who just say, they call it like they see it, and it's just like, that seemed.
And they almost take delight in just kind of like being in people's face and really, getting everybody kind of shocked in the room by the bluntness in which they speak. And so I think a lot of Christians feel like, well, we just need to always be kind and gracious and long-suffering and so on, regardless, if that's what it means to be like Jesus. But of course, even with Jesus, he did cleanse the temple. Mm-hmm. He did call Pharisees brood of vipers, and whitewashed tombs, and so there's something more going on. And I think the problem with a lot of Christians and people in general is we have a hard time striking the right balance. Yeah, we tend to lean too much one way or the other. And there's an interesting passage. I think it gets cited a lot in leadership circles, but I think sometimes we need to stop and really think what it means. And in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus, of course, is going to be sending out his disciples 2 by 2. And Matthew 10 is actually a great chapter in just seeing the kind of leadership teaching preparation that Jesus gave his disciples. And it says that he always called them to himself. And so he gathers them together. He teaches them, he prepares them, equips them, gives them power and authority. And then he sends them out. And one of the things he says in verse 16 of Matthew 10 is, "Look, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves," which is in itself
that's some imagery
fascinating there. Image there, isn't it? Because you think we're children of the King. We're armed for spiritual warfare. We have the Holy Spirit within us. It's not the most encouraging thing. Like, if I've coached my boys in their soccer teams, their inline hockey teams, and a couple of different sports. And there were times where we played teams that were much bigger, much stronger, a bit more skilled. I don't know that I would have ever said, boys, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves.
Well, it certainly doesn't strike confidence.
No.
In the ear of the listener.
And of course, the Bible often describes God's people as sheep, and that's, number one, not necessarily a compliment of our IQ, but also of our ability to defend ourselves. Where sheep are easy prey for a wolf, a fox. There's not, all they can do is run away and hope they don't get caught, because there's not much they can do.
Die of cardiac arrest.
They're not going to enter into a big fight,
right,
and try to bite the fox back or something, stomp the wolf with their hooves or whatever. It's pretty well all over if the enemy gets in too close.
Yeah.
And so the only way, it's a bit ironic, the only way a sheep can stay safe, not even be smart, because they're not that smart either. They've got to stay close to the shepherd, basically. But so he says, you're basically sheep, and if the enemy gets his clutches on you, there could be a lot of damage. So he says, the answer is, therefore, be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves. And he goes on to talk about being aware of them and so on. But that phrase, being shrewd as serpents, innocent as doves, I think in some ways describes the Christian leader. And sometimes I think we think that we just need to be innocent as doves, that Christians always just mean well, are always kind, always turn the other cheek, always think the best of everyone. And I mean, I think that you should certainly have that inclination, but as Jesus makes it very clear, there's a lot of wolves out there, and they would be happy for you to turn the other cheek. They'd be happy for you to not fight back. And before long, you'll all be dead, And so, so there is a time, I think, to be shrewd as serpents. And serpents, of course, have their own weaponry, if you will. Some serpents can bite, and others don't really. Some are just
squeeze you to death.
Yeah, they squeeze you to death, or they flee themselves. They just always are aware of what could step on them or harm them in some way. I remember here at this house here in Atlanta, I guess a couple years ago now, just all of a sudden hearing, I think my daughter-in-law, Sarah, hollering, and might have been your wife as well. And we look out a picture kind of window there in our living room, and there is a big black snake that has raised his head up, and he's literally looking kind of in the window, and he's slithered up on the driveway, and I had just never seen anything like that, right outside our front window. And so I went out to the garage, grabbed a hoe or something, and he was starting to come in the open garage, and he kind of saw me coming and turned around, and literally I just grabbed a hoe and jumped out to attack him, and he was gone. I mean, and I just remember looking around, and there's just no way he could have made it that fast, I don't think. Certainly down the driveway to the street, and even really across the driveway to the grass or shrubs. I've always thought the only thing he might have done is found some kind of hole between the house and the driveway, and just slid down to below the house somewhere.
That's comforting.
Yeah, it's comforting to know that there are snakes.
But the good
breeding.
thing is, if it was a big black snake, then those are the good snakes.
Yeah, and I
want to kill them.
I was assured of that. I was assured that big black snakes are the good snakes, and I tried to explain that to my wife.
Yeah,
don't worry.
Good luck.
Dwelling and breeding and multiplying right below our house are a bunch of really good black snakes.
Perhaps even in the walls.
Yeah,
who knows? Really.
Don't let's not let Lisa listen to this podcast.
Yeah, I'll tell her to skip this one.
Yeah. So, but the snake I mean, it's big, it's black, it looks pretty.
It's powerful.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
It apparently they feed on rats and stuff like that. So you kind of want them. They're called a rat snake, I think. So the big one. So, but it knew to get out of there, and it did quickly and was gone. I've never seen it since. And for quite a while, Lisa would not just go out our front door. She would open the door and peer around the corner to make sure there were no other black snakes waiting nearby. But that, and you know what that said to me is, there's got to be snakes living around here I just haven't seen. They're smart enough to just dwell in places where you're just not going to run into them very often and get into trouble. And so it seems very counterintuitive for Jesus to tell his own disciples act like snakes. There's just something about it that doesn't sound right.
Yeah. Well, and you know, the snake being sort of the emblem of evil and the devil, and so it's like, this kind of doesn't compute, I think, for a lot of people. Like, what does that even mean? Yeah. And I do think with snakes, like, they're probably some of the most aware of their surroundings type of animal that we have, because like they could be living among you and you'd never know.
And they kind of like it to keep it that way for the most part. Yeah,
that's their preference.
Even Genesis 3, it doesn't say that necessarily the snake was evil. Of course, it's inhabited by someone who's evil and Satan, but it says it was cunning.
Yeah. And
there's something, cunning kind of has negative overtones, but it basically means shrewd. It means wise in a sense, cunning in the sense of dealing with other people. And of course, if you use that to manipulate people, that's a bad thing. If you use it so that you're not taken advantage of or manipulated, it's not necessarily so bad. And that's really what I think Jesus was trying to say is, you can't necessarily always be victorious just because you're bigger and stronger, richer than everybody else. Mm-hmm. So you've got to be shrewd and be adept at dealing with different kinds of people. And so there's lots of things to say about that. I think in essence, it means that you're not naive. And it even says of Jesus, he knew what was in men. Mm-hmm. And so he did not submit himself to them. Jesus could have been martyred a year or two earlier than he finally was crucified, but it wasn't his time yet. And there were times even when he went back to Nazareth, his hometown, where it says that they tried to throw him off a cliff and kill him, but he eluded them. He passed through them, kind of like a snake. They couldn't get their hands on him, and he escaped to safety. And so Jesus is saying, don't be naive. Don't be easily duped. There's a difference, between being an honest person yourself and then just being taken to the cleaners because you were just way too trusting and so on. And we've talked about this guy that conned me out of some money. And part of my problem is that one of the other things I think you have to be careful of is you have to know that people aren't like you. And so you might never brazenly look someone in the eye and just flat out lie to their face about what you're going to do. And so it doesn't cross your mind sometimes to think that someone else would be doing that to you, you know? And so Jesus was saying, you're good men, these disciples, you're good people, you mean well, but you're going to be working in the midst of people who aren't always so good, and they're not always so honest. And so that means that you don't just become a kind of a naive martyr all the time where you're just always being taken advantage of, but that you know what are in people. And so that means things like there are people that they're going to break their contracts. They're going to lie to you. They're going to be unethical. They're going to not follow through with what they said they were going to do. And you have to realize, sadly, that when you're doing business, when you're working with people, even when people say they're going to do something, that doesn't mean they're going to do something. Yeah. And I certainly have learned, sadly, that even when someone says, hey, we're both honest businessmen, we don't need to put anything in writing, or your word's good for me, you might say, well, I'm glad to know that, but I'd still like it in writing. And I'd still like you just to spell out exactly what it is that you're going to do and for what price and by what date.
Well, and I think even for church workers, for pastors and so forth, like I think of even just when you're collecting volunteers for whatever you're doing, that means you don't keep relying on an unreliable volunteer. You know, like if someone in the church says, oh yeah, well, I'll be there to help clean up that yard or do whatever, and they don't, then that may mean, well, like maybe you don't ask them again, or maybe if you do, you realize that, they may not show up. And so, better have a backup plan. It doesn't mean just keep asking and just, throw up my hands. I don't know why they just won't do what they say.
Yeah. Over and over and over again, they have the same problem, but I don't make adjustments. And, I think that unfortunately it's sad, but you can't just trust everyone's word. You can't trust that what they say is what they're going to do. So just because someone said they're going to, like I've got, I'm working out with a young man I know that drives Lyft, and I've got to catch a flight to the airport next week at 4:45 in the morning, and I'm just a little nervous about just trusting Lyft just to put in a call and then wait to see, because my flight's not that long afterward. So I've got a young guy who said he'd be glad to come get me, and I'll pay him for it, and we'll use the Lyft app to work it out. But I said, you just be in my driveway at 4:45 on Monday morning. Now, he is very sincere. I have no doubt that he intends to do that, but I also just don't know how good he is first thing in the morning. And
right.
And if I'm counting on him remembering that, I could be in big trouble if he sleeps in and just forgot. So I'm fully intending to remind him the night before, and reminding him to set his alarm. And I may even ask him just to text me when he starts off toward my house, so I know that he's up and coming. And I also have my app ready if I have to at the last moment call for another ride, or call my son-in-law to come quickly and get me.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I hope your son-in-law is awake at that time. Which there's a good chance he will be.
He's got two kids, but
up in the night.
But what that means is sometimes you can give a person a chance to be true to their word, but at the same time, you are aware that some people, even with the best of intentions, don't follow through, and they forget to set their alarm. They just got busy. And so I find that to be shrewd as serpents means also that you've got backup, and you're not, you know that people do sometimes forget, even for the best of reasons. Stuff comes up, mm-hmm. and people have to cancel. And so shrewd as serpents means you don't put all your eggs in one basket and then just go to, just assume it'll all be fine. Sometimes it is. But if you're not prepared for the occasional mess ups, then you're going to be completely thrown off, and you could really be harmed. And so, checking references, checking track records. I mean, if a person has been reliable and you've used them a dozen times already, then obviously you can kind of relax a bit more and realize, okay, this guy's reliable. But certainly in relating to new people, in particular strangers that you don't know well, you want to have that shrewdness up front, and just trust the red flags that come up. The Holy Spirit within you can certainly alert you to trouble, but you have to recognize His promptings and warnings, mm-hmm. and recognize His voice. And maybe one last thing I would just say with shrewdness is just address issues quickly. So when there is a problem, don't just sweep it under the rug. Don't just say, well, I'll have to deal with that at some point. I think shrewdness says, things only get worse the longer they're left unattended. So as a rule of thumb, when it's just maybe appearing that there could be a problem, if you jump on it now, maybe you avoid an actual problem developing. It was trending that way, but you had a heart-to-heart talk early on. You addressed the issue, the concern, and perhaps you've avoided something a lot worse down the road. So lots of things to say about that. I think sometimes pastors, I was talking to a policeman the other day that was just saying people like pastors and Christian business people often are the easiest to take advantage of, because they're honest people. They assume others are honest. They want to assume the best of people, even when they're giving all kinds of vibes that they shouldn't be trusted. And so in one sense, if you really do have a generous, gracious heart, you almost have to be a little more conscious of being shrewd as a serpent, because that won't be your nature. You won't like having to act that way. But for the sake of your church, for the sake of your company, for the sake of your family, for the sake of just your own well-being, even Jesus said there are times where in this evil age, you just need to be alert. And so that the first half of that saying sometimes you need to be a little snake-like.
Yeah, well, it's maybe sounds a bit strange, I think, for a lot of folks, but I just think the imagery is so great in that passage of a snake, a dove, a sheep. Well, maybe after the break, we'll look at the flip side of this, which is being innocent as a dove. If you've ever wondered how to ask the right questions to move people onto God's agenda, then consider attending the Spiritual Leadership Coaching Workshop May 2nd through 4th in the Atlanta area. Not only is there great teaching at this workshop, but you will also be able to practice what you learn. Use code EARLYBIRD at checkout for a special discount. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org/workshop. Links will be in the show notes. So Richard, the first half of this, we looked at what it means to be shrewd as a serpent, and there's many more things I'm sure that could be said on that topic. But since this is just one episode, we'll put a pin in it there and look now to the innocence of doves and what that entails for us as leaders and as Christians.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a story told, and I forget which king it was, who went by in his kingdom one day to a prison and was talking to the inmates, and everyone he talked to swore they were innocent. And sire, I'm innocent. And I think he finally met a guy who said, "I'm here for my crimes I justly deserved. I broke the law. I deserve to be here." And the king finally said, "Release this man. We need to protect all these innocent people from this one guilty guy." But oftentimes we all think that we're innocent, even if we're not. And but Jesus said, but you need to strive to genuinely be innocent, where you've not lied, you've not misrepresented yourself, you're not cheated, that you are in the position you're in, not because you just covertly try to subvert people and lie about them and destroy them, but that you have been above board in all your dealings. And so being truly innocent as a dove, and a dove is kind of such a harmless animal that you just don't think of it as doing anything to, hurt someone else. And if you see a snake and a dove, and somebody did something wrong, who everybody's going to suspect.
Right, the snake.
But how can you do that? The question for a lot of Christian business people, especially, is in this dog-eat-dog world where there's a lot of corruption and deceit and lies, how can I protect myself, be shrewd as a serpent when I have to be, and yet, at the end of the day, still have a heart that's good, the heart that's innocent, that I haven't become evil. I haven't been sort of dragged down into the muck and the mire where a lot of other people do business. How can I go home at night? And I've had to make some tough calls. I've had to confront some unethical behavior, and I've had to call out some things that are not true. But then you walk in the door and you hug your 3-year-old little daughter and kiss your wife, and you think, and you come home with a good heart all the same.
Yeah, you don't want to become cynical. I think that's the easiest sort of slippery slope to fall into if you're trying to be shrewd as a serpent.
Yeah, and so I think you have to. The Bible talks at places about guard your heart. Don't let that evil that you may have to deal with evil. Maybe a good part of the day. I've walked through prisons where Christian prison guards are dealing with evil, and people are trying to manipulate them all day long and work the system. And when you come home, you don't want to keep acting like a prison guard with your kids, and your spouse. And so how can you kind of work with some tough people, some tough situations, but have a heart that's still tender and a heart that is still innocent and is good? And so you guard your heart. Be careful that you don't start becoming cynical. Listen to yourself. Listen to your thoughts. Audit your thoughts. And sometimes we could be appalled if we just stopped and listened to what was coming out of our mouth and what we were thinking, and you realize, wow, I'm becoming cynical. I'm becoming negative. I'm becoming critical of everybody. And I've had some people. I've talked to some policemen that their whole job. Some were narcotics officers, and so their entire job was looking for especially working with teenagers and young people, at looking for what's wrong. And they're experts at finding what's wrong. Well,
right.
That's good when you're a policeman. That's what you need to do. But then they would get all tearful and tell me, but when they came home, they couldn't turn it off. And
right.
so they were looking at their teenage kids, not at all the good they were doing, but just always all with a cynical, jaundiced eye toward where what are they hiding from me? What's going on? And of course, if you're always looking for that, you're going to find something that at least appears to be that way. Mm-hmm. And so watch your heart, remain humble, and confess your own sins. Recognize you're not perfect. And I think one other thing I would just say is really strive yourself to be an honest person. Mm-hmm. I think it was Mark Twain who said, if you're an honest person, you don't have to have a good memory. And he meant by that, when you tell lies, you got to always remember what lies you told so you can stick to your story. You don't change the story and get caught. And so it's like, okay, what did I tell this guy? Why did I tell this guy that the shipment hadn't been sent yet? I got to make sure I keep telling that same lie. And so I got to remember what lie I told to who. He said, get very stressful when you're constantly living a false life. But he said it's very freeing if you just always tell the truth. And sometimes it can seem more convenient. It can seem like you're going to avoid trouble if you just tell a little white lie here. But once you start down that slope, you're becoming more and more like a serpent in the wrong sense. Mm-hmm. And so try to remain as innocent as you can and soft. And I found one other thing I would just say with that is that I've found in just dealing with some people, like there's times where I'll deal with someone and maybe they're just kind of a blowhard, or they just love to talk and tell you their opinion and maybe be critical of others. And sometimes, and maybe this is my flesh, but there are times where I just feel like someone just needs to take them down a peg. Someone just needs to call that out. I'm just not going to buy into that and just kind of fan their ego or whatever. And I can get kind of tough sometimes and just kind of be confrontive and call some stuff out when it needs to be. But then on the other hand, you get around other people and you show them a little bit of kindness and they just thrive. I was on a plane with someone last week, a young lady that had a really tough life and had already been through a divorce early in her life and had a very abusive mother and just some really tough stuff. And we're just on a short flight and I'm never going to see this person again. She's going to another part of the country, but I just felt like, here's a person, and she told me she's Buddhist, she's not a Christian, and we don't have hardly anything in common, but I just showed her a little kindness. I just, I was not judgmental of her. I just showed some interest in her life. And, like 20 minutes in, like she kind of stopped and said, I can't believe I'm telling you all this. She said, I'm so sorry. Like, I normally just don't talk about my life to people. And, I just felt like all I was doing was just showing some kindness and interest. And it just sounded like she'd had a really tough life. And she's covered in tattoos all over. And just looking at her, you're going to say this person probably has nothing in common with me. But I just felt like she doesn't need a snake here. She looks like she's spent most of her life around serpents. Mm-hmm. She needs a dove, someone that isn't trying to get anything from her, purely just trying to bless her in the few moments we have on this flight together. And so, I think our default should be to just be a blessing, to be kind, to be mm-hmm. gentle toward people. But you can always go into that serpent mode if you start to get some red flags popping up. And there are times where it's just really not appropriate to keep being a dove when you discover you're sitting next to a wolf. Then that's when you put on you put on the wise as serpent kind of routine, and you may not like it. You may want to get out of that mode as quickly as possible. But I think to be an effective leader, you have to have a serpent-like mode that you can put on when you need to, just mm-hmm. for your survival. And maybe that's what the other person kind of needs right now, coming back their way. They don't need more gentle doves right now, just kind of affirming them. they may need some wise handling. And so for some of us, you get pretty weary doing the serpent thing for too long.
Yeah.
And that's good. I think that's always as called for. Hopefully most of the time in your relationships, you can just be innocent as you conduct yourself and be kind and gentle with folks. And that's great. But if you're always that way, inevitably you're going to come across a wolf that's going to really give you a rough going over because you couldn't switch. You couldn't defend yourself against that. And so watch your heart. You may have to deal with some wolves, but keep a tender heart and if you'll do that and kind of do what's appropriate, the Spirit of God can help you to know what that is. You can thrive even in a very evil, deceptive environment that can be our world at times.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking us through that. And it's always comes down to that balance of learning to be both. And we'll leave it there for now. And until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.